If you look at the Rhineland from a great height, you will notice different structures. On the one hand, the name-giving River Rhine meandering through the area. On the other hand, there are also the large pits of the lignite open-cast mine. And finally, the very distinctive structures of the city of Cologne. Today, the city is apparently semicircular in different bowls on the river. But how did these structures come about? The Ubier were a tribe settling in the Germanic area on the right bank of the Rhine. These were resettled on the left bank of the Cologne Bay in the Roman domain by the Roman general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa during one of his governorship in Gaul. Gaul essentially corresponded to today's France, but extended as far as the Rhine. The fictional comic heroes Asterix and Obelix are still known today. Today, it is mostly assumed that the founding of this Ubier settlement was done around 19 BC. The history of Cologne begins with this Roman fortified settlement. Agrippina the Younger, daughter of the general Germanicus and later wife of the Emperor Claudius, was born in this settlement in 15 AD. She managed to have her husband elevated her native city to Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium in 50 AD, a city under Roman law. A colonia had much more extensive rights, for example, Roman civil rights. The city grew and then became more and more important. Here is the structure of the city at that time, as far as one could reconstruct this from excavations. Parts of the structures and walls are still there today and can be viewed. Here, for example, part of the north wall with the Lysolf Tower, named after a patrician family from the Middle Ages, who is said to have owned the tower. About 500 meters or 1,600 feet away, the remains of the so-called Hellenan Tower, of which only the lower part is still originally Roman. In the Middle Ages, it was part of the Poor Clare Monastery. Roman cities always had a main street in their layout, which ran strictly in north-south direction, the so-called Cardo Maximus. This still exists today and corresponds to the Hohe Strasse. There was also a main street that ran strictly in an east-west direction, the so-called Documanus Maximus. This also still exists today and consists of the streets Neumarkt, Schildergasse, and Götzenichstrasse. Also to be seen here is the offshore Rhine island, which, depending on the water level of the Rhine, could also be reached dry. The Roman city's warehouses stood on top of it. The depression between the city and the island was filled in more and more over time, and so the area was finally built on and secured by further ramparts and walls around 950 AD. The population continued to rise, and so in 1106, a second, significantly larger city expansion was carried out. It was carried out on the instructions of Emperor Heinrich IV, against the will of the Archbishop of Cologne, and protected suburban settlements through new, expanded fortifications in the north, west, and south. These structures can still be seen in the cityscape to this day. In 1180, the urban area began to be expanded again, initially against the will of the Archbishop. From 1191, a mighty wall was built on the rampart with 12 archways. When the work was completed in 1259, Cologne was the most powerful fortress city north of the Alps. The old Roman main roads were extended and now led to the new main gates in the north Eigelstein Gateway, west Hahnen Gateway, and south Severan's Gateway. All of the archways are still there today. The main traffic connections to Neuss, Aachen, and Bonn, which have existed since Roman times, began from the gates, and these streets are still in existence today and bear the corresponding names. The city retained this structural character until the Prussian era. During this time, the areas in front of the city wall were essentially kept free from larger vegetation and buildings in order to be able to identify possible enemies as early as possible and not give them any cover. Most of the fields were laid out behind the trenches of the city wall. This can still be seen on this picture at the end of the 19th century, even if the city wall had already been ground down, and only the city gates still existed. These areas, which were in principle also used for military reasons, were then supplemented by forts, for example, fortresses in Prussian times. From 1819, the inner fortress ring was built in front of the Cologne city wall. Here are the forts 1, 4, 5, and 10 that have remained to this day. From 1871, this was supplemented by an outer fortress ring. The forts on this ring were connected by the military ring road. This is still one of the heavily used ring roads around Cologne. With the beginning of industrialization and the age of the railways, the open spaces were welcome opportunities for rail routes. On the Cologne-Aachen-Belgium route, the first section in Cologne was opened by the Rheinische Eisenbahngesellschaft in 1839. It was the 7th railway line in Germany as a whole and the first to go abroad. Belvedere Station is one of the original stations. It is the oldest existing station building in Germany. Shortly thereafter, the Bonn-Kölner Eisenbahngesellschaft opened a line to Bonn, and the Köln-Krefeld Railway opened a line to Krefeld. Both companies were taken over by the Rheinische Eisenbahn, and the route networks were combined. In 1880, the railway was finally nationalized by Bismarck. In the meantime, the city was restructured in the north, and a central train station was built north of the cathedral, as well the so-called Cathedral Bridge over the Rhine. Note the missing towers at the cathedral in the background. Industrialization also created a need for workers and housing for them. In 1881, the city wall, which was now restricting the city, began to be torn down. At that time, Cologne had around 150,000 inhabitants. The urban area was expanded and built up to the railway lines leading in the ring around the city. In 1890, the city already had 280,000 inhabitants. After the First World War, Cologne was occupied by the British Army. According to the will of the British, the fortifications should no longer be used and should be demolished. Konrad Adenauer, who was Cologne's mayor at the time, managed to ensure that not all forts had to be demolished and that the surrounding area could be converted into parks according to a general development plan by the Hamburg city planner Fritz Schumacher. The Green Belt was created. The expansion of the settlements around the city took place in modern times along the radial arterial roads, that is, radiating outwards from the city center. On the basis of this Prussian map from 1870, this can be seen clearly from the Aachener and Dürener Straße. After the extensive destruction of Cologne after the Second World War, parts of the existing cross-connections were connected to another road ring, the Gürtel, or in English, belt. The older parts can be recognized by the missing median and by the Wilhelminian-style houses, 1840 to 1870. Even though Germany's first public motorway from Cologne to Bonn was completed in 1932, the motorway ring on the left bank of the Rhine was not completed until between 1957 and 1965. Today, Cologne has almost 1.1 million inhabitants, and it is expected that it will continue to grow to around 1.3 million inhabitants.